Hello, dear friends. Before we dive in, if this is your first time here, do consider hitting subscribe and tapping the bell. This channel puts out a fresh briefing every single day. And with how fast things are moving right now, on the front and around Iran, you really don't want to miss an update. Alright, you're watching the Ruslan Belov channel, and this is your daily briefing on combat operations from the Ukrainian front. Today we'll cover the latest developments, both from the front and from the political and military angle. Yesterday, Trump spoke at the White House and was asked whether the US would supply Ukraine with missiles for the Patriot systems. Trump answered that America needs those missiles itself, and that Biden simply gifted Ukraine $300 billion. Of course, $300 billion is a wildly inflated figure. In reality, Ukraine received only a few tens of billions from the US toward its budget for pensions and so on. The rest was spent on weapons, and that money largely stayed inside the US, even though Ukraine did receive the hardware. It's a talking point Trump has used before, and it tends to resurface whenever he wants to justify holding back on new commitments. In short, Trump doesn't want to hand Ukraine those missiles because the war in Iran has entered a phase that's very uncomfortable for him. With no end in sight, he doesn't want to be left with thin stockpiles if something happens elsewhere. As American newspapers have made clear, the US has serious problems with air defense missiles, meaning Washington can barely sustain even the war with Iran, let alone a confrontation with a more serious adversary. The US is now, in effect, tied down by Iran, and that's a remarkable position for a country that started this war expecting a quick, decisive outcome. Trump badly wants to end this war, but Iran, sensing America's weakness, isn't letting him walk away from the conflict. It seems Trump didn't expect this scenario at the start of the war. As it drags on, Washington's position keeps getting weaker relative to where it started, and every additional week seems to cost the US more leverage than it gains. My own view is that the conflict with Iran has only taken a brief pause because of the US missile shortage, not because either side has actually backed down. Trump, incidentally, threatened to sue whoever leaked this data, claiming the US has plenty of missiles. But we all understand the leaked numbers are real, and the shortage is genuine, both for offense and defense. Most likely, once the US manages to rebuild its missile stocks, a new wave of escalation will follow, because ending the war while Iran still controls the Strait of Hormuz is not something Washington wants. The US has enormous business interests in the Persian Gulf, banks, oil companies, defense contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Nobody is going to just walk away from that. I recently learned that the UAE, near Abu Dhabi, has an oil field called Zakum, which ExxonMobil will be developing, with reserves that are simply astronomical. More than 10 billion tons of oil there alone, or about 66 billion barrels. Just imagine those volumes, and it becomes obvious the US isn't leaving this region anytime soon. A field of that size alone is worth more, strategically, than most countries' entire annual output. There's also news from Europe. Several European countries have refused to supply Kyiv with Patriot missiles, according to the Washington Post, citing sources. The reason is fear of depleting their own stockpiles. European governments, the main military backers of Ukraine, are reluctant to hand over additional Patriot systems out of concern it would weaken their own defenses. Earlier this year, the Trump administration pushed several European states to send Patriot missiles to Kyiv, but some declined for the same reason. Overall, it looks like Zelensky is starting to realize nobody's going to keep gifting him missiles, and strikes on Kyiv are now going to be a permanent feature. A completely new reality is setting in for Kyiv residents, and if I have viewers there, it's worth thinking about relocating to another country, or at least to a calmer city, while there's still time to make that decision calmly rather than under pressure. Now let's look at what's happened on the front. There are changes on the Kharkiv direction. The settlement of Aniskino was taken today by Russian forces, and objective control footage has already come in. This settlement, while small, is important. Russian forces are clearly aiming at Blahodatne. To its east lie the settlements of Cherne and Nefedivka, and the distance to Blahodatne is roughly 9 kilometers. It looks like Russian command has seriously decided to clear out this pocket by the end of August, and the odds of that happening are quite high. I'll remind you, this pocket covers more than 350 square kilometers and dozens of small settlements. which gives a sense of just how much ground is still in play here. Once that territory is cleared, keep in mind some AFU fighters are hiding out in dugouts, and they'll need to be flushed out so they don't roam the rear. That will take some time, and it's usually this mop-up phase, not the advance itself, that drags on longest. After that comes Prikolotny. I expect the push toward Prikolotny to come from Verivka and Bakshivka, both taken recently. Problems for the Ukrainian army on this direction keep growing. The infantry shortage is showing. The front here is being held mostly by FPV drones, and even that isn't helping much, since one, sometimes two settlements are being taken every couple of days. Incidentally, it's become known that Ukrainian command has redeployed a large number of Colombian mercenaries here. Yesterday it was also reported that around 16,000 Colombian mercenaries are fighting in Ukraine, an enormous number. But that's not all. Apparently, Colombian drug cartels are deliberately sending their own men to Ukraine to gain real combat experience, which they then intend to use back home against their own army, since that army has acquired electronic warfare systems and has managed to down FPV drones the cartels tried using. It's a strange, almost cynical loop, a foreign war becoming a training ground for a completely unrelated conflict back home. So that's the picture there. Now let's move to the Medjov direction, where there's also news of Russian advances. Russian positions south of Novopidorodny came under a Ukrainian strike, and Russian forces advanced about 2 kilometers westward. In other words, the ground between the two settlements is essentially being cleared. Earlier, we had reports that Russian troops were trying to enter Raiske, but since then we haven't gotten further data on any developments there. Now to the Zaporizhia direction, where interesting data is coming in. As you know, we discussed yesterday and the day before that Russian forces managed to enter Orikhiv itself. Now there's information that Russian troops have not only entered Orikhiv, but also pushed into the northwestern part of Tokmachka. This isn't marked on the map yet, but it should be updated within a couple of hours. I'll show you footage of the area where Russian soldiers were spotted, identified by Russian OSINT analysts based on video from the AFU's 118th Brigade, showing strikes on a building where Russian infantry was reportedly detected. Yesterday there were reports that Russian forces apparently failed to gain a foothold in Orikhiv, but this new information from Tokmachka suggests things may not be so simple. It's entirely possible Russian forces have gained a foothold both in Orikhiv and in Tokmachka, including at the point through which Ukrainian forces supply their troops, which would be a genuinely serious problem for the defenders if it holds up. If some infantry really has managed to dig in there, the fate of Tokmachka could well be decided before the end of summer. Remember, I told you yesterday to expect good news before the end of the month. Well, there are already some updates. This is still just a small part of what's actually happening here. So far, it's only what could be shown. Beyond the push toward Tokmachka, there's also progress through the tree lines north of Bilohirya, the closing of the pocket near Shchebaki, plus a further 3 kilometers advance north of Shchebaki. That's not everything. More updates on this direction will come in over the following days, so keep an eye on tomorrow's briefing as well. From Vishnev in Dnipropetrovsk region, we received footage of drone strikes and an Iskander strike on a train carrying Ukrainian military hardware. What we're shown is really the aftermath. The vehicles hit and the train completely destroyed. Also, over the past day, strikes hit 3 vessels that had arrived in Ukrainian ports but didn't quite make it out. I wonder how many more ships will keep trying to dock there and taking drone hits on their hull. I get that insurance covers the loss, but that's how people end up getting killed too. According to the GMK Information and Analysis Center, the current naval blockade is hitting Ukraine's metallurgical industry harder than it did at the start of the conflict. Ukraine risks losing 35 to 40% of its output if the blockade continues for another couple of months. Metallurgy brings in solid foreign currency earnings and a fair amount of budget revenue for Ukraine, so this is a slower burning but very real economic pressure point. Moving on. Nothing on the Berivsky direction. Nothing on the Lyman direction either. People often ask, what's happening with Lyman? Back in June it seemed like the city was about to fall any day. But AFU counterattacks from both south and north have done their job and delayed Lyman's fall, and it's a good reminder that these directions rarely move in a straight line. Nothing new on the Sloviansk direction. On the Druzhkivka direction, there's progress in the town of Oleksievo-Druzhkivka, though it's not yet reflected on the map. Russian infantry is advancing inside the settlement, and about half of Oleksievo-Druzhkivka is now under Russian control. On the Khomar sector, the situation remains difficult. AFU keeps mounting dashes, trying to break into Khomar without success. They've now been trying for 2.5 months, with losses running into the hundreds, and still without reaching their objective, a costly pattern that shows no sign of changing. We covered the Vostok grouping of forces zone yesterday. No changes over the past day. On the western Zaporizhia direction, the map shows movement toward Pavlivka, but yesterday came word that Russian forces had restored control over Pavlivka. So the situation on the ground is actually better than the map shows. This is information from soldiers on the ground and hasn't yet been confirmed by footage, which is why Pavlivka isn't shaded red on the map, only grey. But I trust the soldiers, and if they say Pavlivka is under Russian control, then it's under Russian control. Summing up the past 24 hours, no settlements were fully taken, but all these small advances on the Orikhiv and Zaporizhia directions, added together, come to a solid 28.5 square kilometers. So over the past day, 28.5 square kilometers passed under Russian control. Now, before we wrap up, an update on the Strait of Hormuz, since there's real movement there. Iran says it has reached an agreement in principle with Oman on a new shipping route through the strait, with a joint Tehran-Muscat statement now in its final drafting stage. Both sides say they've agreed on the coordinates of a proposed safe corridor and on a joint coordination center to manage traffic. But Iranian officials are stressing that a deal with Oman alone won't automatically reopen the waterway. Washington's position is still the sticking point, and Tehran is demanding the US lift its blockade on Iranian ports as part of any wider arrangement. Trump, speaking from the Oval Office yesterday, called the strait sort of open right now, while insisting the US blockade remains in force, adding that an announcement could be soon, though he's made clear he's not eager to sign off on anything that hands Iran more control over the strait long term, which tells you the American and Iranian versions of reopening are still quite far apart. The traffic numbers show just how far things still are from normal. Before the war, somewhere around 70 to 100 plus vessels a day passed through Hormuz. Right now, we're talking about a handful of transits a day. Some trackers logged 0 tanker transits on individual days this week. For the week of July 27–August 2, total transits came in around 84, up from 45 the week before, which is an improvement, but still a fraction of the 500-plus weekly transits considered normal before the war started in February. Meanwhile, American reserves keep sliding. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is now down to roughly 305 million barrels, a fresh multi-decade low, well under half of its 714 million barrel capacity, after being drawn down over 100 million barrels since the strait first closed. Commercial crude stocks have swung around week to week, but the overall US buffer is thinning, and that's without factoring in what a real supply shock would do if the strait closed fully again. And here's what I personally find suspicious. Oil prices haven't moved anywhere near what you'd expect, given a genuinely restricted Hormuz and falling reserves. Brent has mostly been sitting in the high 70s to high 80s range, nowhere close to the panic spikes we saw back in the spring, even though the underlying physical picture looks arguably worse now than it did then. My own suspicion is that Washington is leaning on the futures market itself, through the big US banks trading on the Chicago exchanges, to keep a lid on the headline price, regardless of what's actually happening physically at the strait. Make of that what you will, but the gap between the physical supply picture and the price action is hard to explain any other way, and it's something I'll keep watching closely in the coming weeks. That's it for today's Frontline situation. Thanks for watching, take care of yourselves,